Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing my 14.18 top lane tier list. So for your content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. This was a huge patch. We had a plethora of changes. Obviously, this was to incentivize some champions being removed or picked at Worlds. On top of this, we saw some rune adjustments. Fleet once again got hit as it was the most performant keystone for a lot of the mid lane marksman mages, which we were primarily seeing as like the dominant force. However, towards the end, they were already fading out. I believe this just seals the deal. We won't really see any Tristana or Corki at Worlds, I don't believe. On top of this, it did affect obviously some top laners, combined with the fact that they tried to neutralize the power loss for melee champions, so some champions have kind of shifted off when they can still opt into the keystone in certain situations. We saw the takeover of Nasus mid in competitive. That got pretty quickly shut down in this patch. He lost a decent chunk of power from his E, which hurt some of his matchups, so he would definitely take a bit of a hit there. Of course, we saw some buffs. We saw Malphite get buffed, Shen get buffed. These were both pretty big. Jack's got some decent buffs, not quite enough to really shift him a huge amount, but he's still pretty good in the spots you'd want to play him. Nara got buffed, Jace got buffed, we saw Varus nerfs, Aurora nerfs, Smolder nerfs, and I'm going to remove some champions from the tier list which are cluttering up the pool. On top of this, we also saw the biggest change of this patch, Grasp Vladimir. So, this is an interesting one, which I will cover briefly now. So the main thing here was it kind of got popularized by EUS streamer Elite 500 and Kerberos together. It can work quite well in a lot of matchups. It's definitely not what I'd recommend defaulting on, and obviously if you're paying attention to win rates, you'll notice a pretty heavy deflation in his win rate this patch. Yeah, that's definitely going to be a pretty big loss of power when people are defaulting on this build. I wouldn't really recommend it. Obviously, his play rate has shot up. He's currently like the 7th most picked top laner, 6th most picked top laner, which is insane for him to be at. But let's cover the tier list. So, the D tier, going to be losing 5 champions here, or 4 champions actually. Nidalee, Shyvana, Lucian, Twisted Fate are all gone. They're not really played a lot here and no longer really supported in this role. Actually, I will cover the rest of the ones which are being removed. We've got Skarner being removed. He's not really played top anymore. Rengar, very niche audience. Briar, once again, really niche audience. Neferi, kind of hidden, strong top laner, but just not really played a lot. And yeah, the leading D tier champion is going to be Cassante. Obviously, pretty heavily nerfed because of competitive. Not the kind of champ I'd recommend in solo queue. He is being reworked going into 14.19. If you want to check out those changes, they're on SpiderAxe's Twitter. For the moment, I'd recommend avoiding this pick. He is in a pretty rough spot in his current state for the average player. Gangplank, gonna be in the D tier for the most part. He is obviously a very high skill cap top laner, and he can definitely climb up the ranks the more time you sink into him. Very unique playstyle. I'd recommend watching Solo Backer if you want to learn from like a certain Gangplank player. He's very proficient as the champion. Moving on from Gangplank, we have Vayne, who's just taken a lot of hits through system nerfs. She got directly nerfed and then in a way got Riot specialed with all the items which she utilizes being nerfed, which really did hurt her quite substantially. Varus and Smolder, both these picks, pretty interestingly, well, in Varus's case, he was kind of griefing with his build. Like, there was a lot of defaulting on Locket, which wasn't great in a lot of situations, when Lethality Varus was predominantly the best just across the board. That obviously has been nerfed going into this patch quite aggressively. It is still something you can opt into, but overall, Varus just underperforms quite heavily as a top laner at the moment. Not something I'd really recommend unless you've sunk a lot of time into it. In Smolder's case, obviously, the win con of the 225 stacks is still there, but he's been pretty aggressively nerfed. The items, the runes have all been nerfed quite aggressively around him. He's just not really performant in the, like any role across the board at the moment. Yeah, he's definitely struggling, but he's been gaining decent amounts of pick rate in mid and top as like the predominant ADC, and I imagine we'll probably still see him in competitive and most likely at Worlds. The other champion here, actually, there's one other champion which is dropping down, and that is Rumble. So Rumble has been hit with a sledgehammer this patch. They took a huge chunk out of his early game damage. Obviously, this is like the 3rd patch I believe they've done it to him now. Shows just how oppressively overpowered he was in the early game, especially within like elite and competitive ranks. With an average solo queue, he never really like reached anywhere outside of like A tier, but now he's down in the D tier. I'd recommend just avoiding this pick. He's in a pretty rough spot. Maybe the item system being adjusted and like maybe some buffs and like patches down the line will definitely help him out. But for the moment, yeah, I'd recommend avoiding Rumble. He is in a pretty rough spot. Arguably, the only pick I'd really recommend looking at in the D tier, especially just for this patch, because like split changes over going into 14.19, and then there's like a huge amount of changes there. there, which I will cover when that eventually comes out. But Gangplank, if you've sunk a lot of time into him, definitely can be rewarding. Other than that, just really recommend avoiding most of the D tier. Riven is going to be champion leading off the C tier. She is a very hard to pilot pick, very reliant on snowballing, very feast or famine. And for that kind of like, and for some of her mechanics, it's just the kind of pick I'd recommend avoiding pretty early on, and like even like mid and to a degree later on into like someone's like playing career. Like only really with a lot of investment can this pick give back good returns. It's primarily why you only see like OTPs playing Riven. You don't really see her outside of those scenarios. Don't really see her as like a counter pick to certain things. It's just predominantly like those OTPs. Once again, Rammus, I mean, obviously the Battle's popularized this pick. It still sees level of play in the top lane, and it can definitely function into heavy AD compositions. So there's definitely value there, but because of how kind of gimmicky in a way, where oftentimes you're reliant on proxying, getting that early Bramble Vest, utilizing that to like get some sort of lane push, and then scaling up to being this really aggressively magic damage tank, which can like output a huge amount of damage, especially when people are locked into autoing you. So it can be pretty good situationally. For the moment, I wouldn't really recommend Rammus. If you want to play him in the jungle, he can function quite well there. Don't look to have him as like a top lane pick though, as he is very, very situational. Arguably very easy to play though, which can definitely help him to a degree. Nah actually jumps to the top of the C tier. He's very close to pushing the B tier. The free AD buff to him this patch really did help him quite a bit, and enables him to obviously last it a bit better, trade a bit better. The fleet nerfs did hit him a bit, and Grasp doesn't look to be as viable as like a second alternative. If anything, you're looking more towards PTA, maybe Conqueror, but even then that doesn't seem to be looking too good. So fleet once again looks to be pretty default on this champion, even with the nerfs. Yasuo, so I've got Yasuo marked here. There is a build going on with Yasuo at the moment, which is like a Grasp Stride Breaker variant, where like you're going Bork, Stride Breaker, Shilbo, I believe the 3-item core is, and that seems to be gaining some level of play rate and traction at the moment. It's definitely worth looking at. I wouldn't say it's as situational as like Grasp Vladimir, which is obviously tanking Vladimir at the moment. It can definitely be opted into a lot more scenarios. Maybe not default, but definitely look into that. You could find situations where you can pick it, play it, gives you a level of durability, which can oftentimes make up for errors or mistakes within play. And so obviously pretty hard to pilot pick. Definitely takes a lot to get like a good amount of value out of this champion. So if you're not comfortable, then once again you can avoid this champion, but he can definitely function on different build variations, and if you've put a lot of time into the pick. Yone, pretty standard stuff. Obviously, once again, you sink a lot of time to him, you'll definitely be rewarded. He can feel quite oppressive in a lot of lanes with like the Q and the W shield like as like a pairing. Definitely hard to trade for like a lot of champions to trade back against. The E gives him a great safety net and can obviously amp his damage and his chase potential. His R buffering, his R and Q being able to buffer certain situations and then play like utilized together can be very oppressive. Also in a lot of laning phases. And there's definitely a lot of strength to this pick, but for the moment he is in the C tier, as he is, once again, pretty hard to pilot. Olaf, counter pick. Great value. Like the matchups which Olaf is good in, he can oftentimes completely dominate. When Olaf is not great within the game, he can definitely feel really hard to pilot. He's very reliant on like really like snowballing early kills and early advantages. And if you're just not able to consistently get that, this champion can feel really short, fall really short. But if you can find those advantages in the matchups where you really stomp, like you're playing him to like an Ornn or picks which are really reliant on their CC, something like an Urgot for example, then this champion can be really oppressive in those scenarios and can definitely climb up the tier list. But for the moment, he is in the C tier. And then Udyr wraps up the C tier. He can be blinded, and like people oftentimes won't expect you to play Udyr in the top lane, but the pick right now just doesn't seem to be finding the level of traction it is in the having in the jungle. I'm failing English here. Which is obviously kind of built around Liandry's and Fated Ashes being a really powerful pairing. And the top lane just don't really see that level of consistency, especially with Fated Ashes, which obviously does very little damage to minions and to champions, for example. So not doing too well here, but can definitely be more of an OTP played pick, and tends to be a bit pretty, like underrated as just how hard this champion can be to pilot in certain situations, because of obviously like the 4 ability rotations and the ultimate being a different kind of ability to like a lot of other champions having. Moving on to the B tier then, we have Trundle. So Trundle, obviously, I say this all the time, is kind of held up by just how easy he is to play. It's like a auto attack, like stat stick siege based champion. He's kind of like Tryndamere light in a way, where like he's easier to play and oftentimes can be more pilotable and more accessible in those regards. But then Tryndamere has an insanely high ceiling compared to Trundle. Both of them kind of follow the same kind of system of like wanting to be able to like get demolished procs, siege turrets, and then utilize those advantages to really stat check and just stomp people. But Trundle just isn't really strong enough at the moment. I think that's just what it comes down to. Sidus doing a bit better in the top lane. The changes he received over the last couple of patches have actually helped him quite a bit in the top lane, encouraging more like bruiser-centric builds. Obviously, you still have the burst build, and Malphite being a bit more popular this patch, combined with him being a really valuable counterpick into Malphite, can definitely really help him. So he definitely sits as like a mid-B tier option at the moment, but he struggles to really break much higher, as obviously he's pretty reliant on being a counterpick, albeit he can still find success in situations where like if you're ahead of the curve and yeah, your abilities just do an outright decent amount of damage. Jax, the buffs came into this patch, primarily just built around his ultimate, amping up that ability, which I'm glad they did. I think Jax's ult previously felt a bit underwhelming. But now, yeah, the buff to that can definitely help him, definitely allows him to find more kill angles, and oftentimes can, like, result in, like, him maybe surviving a trade, or, yeah, just outright winning a trade. So he goes from, like, a low B tier to, like, a high B tier option. Obviously, this champion pretty aggressively elite skewed at the moment. Maybe we'll untangle that at some point, but, yeah. Definitely, like, the more time you sink into this pick, the more you play him in the counterpick scenarios where you're playing him against champions, which are obviously very reliant on their autos, then yeah, he can really benefit from those situations. Darius, also elite skewed at the moment. Very aggressively early game skewed, unless like you go like kind of decently late, where he can oftentimes curve back up, being it through just like resets within team fights and yeah, like people just not playing around the champion correctly. But yeah, Darius very reliant on like stomping laning phase, converting that into advantages, getting your grubs, getting your heralds, either securing drakes on the other side of the map and then stomping like in the 1v2 scenarios. So that can all be very much like the win cons of Darius. And he can fall quite flat in the mid game if you're just not able to find these situations, which is why he does tend to be a bit elite skewed at the moment and kind of drags him down a bit in the top lane tier list for like average elos at the moment. Quinn, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Play it in mid lane. It's very powerful in mid lane. This is the lethality, obviously, like the Profane Hydra or even Stridebreaker. We've seen some like variations now with like Symbiotic Souls. You're playing around your roaming, your high mobility, looking to like impact side lanes, and yeah, that's kind of how you'd play mid Quinn. Top lane doesn't have the same level of impact. Obviously, you can still roam mid and can definitely hurt mid lane and hurt jungle in different situations. The build, obviously, the Stridebreaker variant, haven't seen a huge amount of it at the moment, but there is potential there. That could definitely be something you opt into. And I know, once again, Carbos has covered this, so check him out if you want to see some Quinn build variations. But yeah, for the moment, she kind of sits within the B tier for me. Aurora keeps being nerfed as like she's getting closer and closer to just jumping up the tier list. Obviously, she looks to be pretty elite skewed at the moment. As once again, more people sink more time into her, learn her more, and like perfect her more, then she would definitely like once again rise back up. She took a pretty big hit though this patch. The ult changes combined with, I believe it was just a flat out nerf, have yeah definitely impacted her a bit, and she drops from like a high B tier to like a low B tier pick. But I imagine by the end of the patch she'll rise back up to being like a high B tier pick, especially if like you sink a lot of time into her once again. So I'm kind of slept on at the moment. He has received some indirect buffs and some direct buffs, in fact. The itemization, there are like some AD bruiser items which can definitely really synergize with him at the moment. I know a lot of Sion players don't really tend to opt into them as much as they probably should. These are like the Sterics, the Overlord Bloodmails, the Titanic Hydras. All these items can synergize really nicely with Sion. Obviously, he can still opt into the tank builds and still be very durable with like his infinitely health stacking pool, where yeah, farming minions gives him like really strong returns on HP. That can all be quite valuable for him. But yeah, there's definitely build variations which people need to mess around with, and he can definitely find a bit more success than where his placement is within my tier list at the moment. Kale definitely lost a bit of power with Fleet being nerfed. Honestly, I haven't even checked this patch. I probably should have. Looks to be just staying within the B tier for the moment. She's like a mid B tier option. Obviously, her scaling very much attributes her to being like a solid mid low elo pick. But she tends to be a bit on the worst side at the moment, with like Fleet obviously being nerfed. Kennen got directly nerfed in 14.17 for 10% AP ratio, removed from Q. Hurt him a bit. It drops him from like a tier pick to like a B tier pick. Obviously, this champion's always been elite skewed for like as long as I remember. There are like different rune variations which you can opt into, which can definitely help him a bit. So his cap isn't B tier by any means. Whether that's like airy, airy, electrocute, first strike, like variations of that, and then even some AD builds. But I wouldn't really recommend dabbling in that route. That tends to be pretty unsuccessful for the most part. But he's like a B tier pick at the moment. That's just what I'm getting at here. Aurelia is also going to be within my B tier. She lost some power, but gained back some through like other champions being nerfed, which she tends to just be a bit more performant into. And some of the champions which have really risen up as like more popular picks, a lot of champions are just poaching win rate off them. Smolder, Vladimir, for example. These picks aren't doing as well at the moment, and yeah, other champions will really gain from that. So yeah, Aurelia kind of sits towards the high end of the B tier at the moment. The bulk changes ended up being pretty like a power loss for her. Her direct changes were slightly power positive, I believe, and very power neutral for like mid low elo. So she sits as like a top of B tier pick, or I would say for the moment. Pantheon. The same goes for like last patch, where his build variations just aren't quite there at the moment, whether this is like the Eclipse, Cleaver, Shojin, Steric variations, which can find success in like a lot of situations. Obviously you want to play around his really aggressive laning phases. He does fall off very aggressively later on into the game, but yeah, the health ratios definitely help like his durability and some of his like arguably bruiser fighting aspects. He still really struggles into tanks. Like, I would not recommend playing Pantheon into tanks unless you're very comfortable about getting early advantages and then snowballing that into a win. But for the moment, he sits as like a high beta option. And then Gragas, obviously the elite skewed AP lane holding pick, which has obviously been considered like the best blind pick in the game at points. Got nerfed like back along, lost some like health ratio off of his passive. I believe it's all the way down to 4.5 at the moment, when it was like 8% at one point, which is crazy to think about. For the moment though, he sits as like a high B tier option. You can win lane on this champion, you can hold lane against most picks, and there can definitely be value to a champion like that. Vladimir actually drops down to the B tier though. Obviously a lot of this comes down to just people tanking his win rate by defaulting on Grasp. I in fact didn't tank his win rate. I actually helped his win rate. I played Vladimir into WoW, who is like one of the best top laners in the solo queue, which is crazy to think about. I went like 1-7 in laning phase, but that's beside the point. This champion obviously has like some strengths, with the W max build being the fact that he can absorb a lot in lane and then like heal through the minion wave, which can be really powerful, but it hurts his trading capabilities in certain matchups where you're not having like your Ares and your Q to like harass him out of lane. It's more of a attrition build, and arguably you could see it as a way of like, I don't want to lose lane here, so I'm just going to play a bit more safe, have W up a bit more, W on the wave, heal through that. And that can definitely be more viable in situations, especially where you're able to get consistent grass stacks as well. But don't default on it. Please go the every Qmax route, or face rush Qmax route, which can be situationally pretty good as well. Yeah, Vladimir should be an A tier pick, but people are kind of tanking him at the moment, so he drops down to like a mid B tier option. Moving on to the A tier, we have the two good situational counter picks to tanks primarily, but being Gwen and Fiora. Gwen has one of the strongest 3-item power spikes in the game, if not just outright the strongest. She is incredibly oppressive on Nasha, Riftmaker, and Rabadon. I know there's some people who are skeptical about like the actual strength of Riftmaker on Gwen, about whether you should go like Protobell, whether you should go Malignance, but if you want just something to default on, then I would recommend than the Riftmaker variant. But there can be some situations where the other variants can definitely have some power. In Fiora's case, obviously, she is also pretty hard to pilot pick. Both these champions are elite skewed in their current state. But if you find the matchups where like parry has so much value and you can split push and not really be answered by like mid or AD, then this champion can be incredibly oppressive and can oftentimes just outright win you games, which is why she sits as like a low A tier option. Mundo should be going Heartstone now as your first item. The Warmog's nerfs have hit that build variation enough that it's just not really worth rushing anymore. So he's definitely lost a lot of power from that. Obviously, he's still a pretty easy to play pick, but he drops from like an S tier to like an A tier at the moment. But if you go Heartstone, you'll be able to recuperate most of that. Rise, pretty slept on pick at the moment. This champion has really benefited from the buffs he received. Obviously, 5Q damage combined with the R buff, which is a bit more placebo. Like that, you're not going to feel that anywhere near as much as just the 5 damage on Q, which is his bread and butter ability. But this champion's been kind of slept on in the top lane for a while, so I would argue deserves a solid spot on the A tier. I've realized I've missed 2 champions here. Akali is in my C tier. So Akali, obviously the itemization tends to be pretty similar to both mid and top Akali. This is just like a traditional electrocute Lichbane burst variant. Shadow Flame got adjusted this patch. It got slightly nerfed for dots champions, but then slightly buffed more generalistically. So she jumps from like a D tier to like a C tier champion at the moment. In Jace's case, for buffs this patch actually push him towards the high end of the C tier. They did do something. They weren't just placebo, even though it was like 5% movement speed on Q and then 5% more slow on 5% more movement speed on E, 5% more movement speed slow on Q, which yeah, looks fairly placebo, but does mean something. It can oftentimes like add up to another auto. It can allow you to chase people more frequently, helps move back to lane, obviously. So it did do something, and like there are build variations there which Jace can opt into, which can definitely help him as well, whether it's like Conqueror, Phase Rush, Fleet, still viable on Jace. It's not suddenly something you can like completely drop. You can still opt into it in situations where you're not really going to get as much value from the other 2 keystones. But continuing with the A tier, we have Singed, who is obviously kind of gimmicky with his playstyle. The proxying, the kind of non-interactive laning phase in a lot of situations can definitely be something to get used to, but once you like pick this champion in the situations where it's strong, or you're like running through team fights and like you can't really be stopped in situations, then like this champion can be really powerful and definitely is a bit slept on, albeit very like OTP heavily played, so can definitely hurt him in that aspect. Renekton, I've gone off Renekton more recently. I think this champion used to be like a solid A tier pick, and like I would recommend Renekton a bit more in the past, but nowadays I think there are just some other champions which are doing a bit better and a bit more performant than him, so he kind of drops to like a low A tier pick. Obviously you have like the PTA, the Conquer variations, you have the Cleaver, the Eclipse variations. Stride Baker can be a good rush option into like heavy range compositions. There are definitely builds and like rune choices which can help him out, but I think he drops from like a mid A tier to like a low A tier option now. Teemo drops down to the B tier, so Teemo has been on a bit of a decline. Obviously, both or like Fleet being nerfed combined with some of the sub runes in that have definitely hurt him a bit. But obviously, he still scales very aggressively with the shrooms, especially if you're playing around those builds. And like Dark Harvest variations and like some other rune choices can definitely still work on Teemo. So yeah, he sits as like a high B tier option. Cassiopeia, great counter pick in the A tier. Has in the past been an S tier pick, but it's slightly nerfed from where she used to be, so yeah, she drops down to the A tier. But if you're able to utilize your kiting capability, your ability to like spam AP and then like utilize your ground, then yeah, this champion can be really powerful in those situations, can definitely sit as like a solid A tier champion. Aatrox, definitely can be really powerful into compositions which have a hard time accessing anti-heal, but low mobility, and yeah, you can oftentimes like continuously sustain fight. That would be on the build variations of like Eclipse, Sundered Sky, and then like some of the other bruiser variant, like bruiser options, whether that's like Sterox, and then like Death Stance, Spirits, Overlord's Bloodmail, Shojin. You have loads of build options there. You of course still have the lethality build accessible to you. That would be the Profane Eclipse, Profane Hydra, and then you can go like Edge of Night, Schroeder's Grudge. That build is still really good at the moment. So yeah, both of those builds can work quite nicely on him. He's definitely a solid A tier pick. arguably like an S tier pick, an elite play at the moment. But yeah, I would say Aatrox is pretty solid as an A tier champion at the moment. Wukong, great counter pick into matchups where you can utilize your passive pretty heavily. That would be the armor stacking combined with the health regen, so you can trade into them and then utilize those aspects of this champion, combined with some different itemization choices at the moment we've seen, whether that's like the Profane Hydras, the Trinity Forces, the Eclipses, even some Sunfire Grasp variations, which I don't believe to be as successful at the moment, but can definitely still be something you can look into. Yeah, Wukong, pretty solid A tier pick in his current state. Tryndamere, great champion as like an answer to like certain picks where they can't really ever stop his like siege potential, or just outright lose to his 1v1 like throughout the game, which can be like certain picks. I know Argot can in situations have a pretty hard time against him. Obviously the W can be quite potent in some of the AD matchups where they do lose a like a portion of their AD, which obviously scales with points in that ability, and that can feel quite nullifying in situations. But overall, Tryndamere, I'd say, sits like a mid A tier option. He still has the Fleet and the Grasp variations with the Ravenous Hydra, which makes him pretty unmovable outside of laning phase. Warwick has been a bit on the rise at the moment. Honestly, both Warwick and Kled as like pretty solid high-end A tier picks. In situations where they like they're utilized as counters, they are very valuable. Like, they're not really even gimmicky to that point. Like, both these picks can definitely hold their own in a lot of situations. Kled's capability in diving and like in dive compositions, combined with like being a solid answer into some of the more health like sustain reliant champions, it's like Mundo, Aatrox, picks like that. Warwick's case, he has great like war of attrition capabilities. The builds have a lot of variety, whether you're going like Stridebreaker, Bork, Titanic Hydra variations. There's like loads of things accessible to him at the moment. And yeah, both these picks I'd say are solid high-end A tiers. Camille, probably the best AD elite pick at the moment. This champion has so much potential and like can oftentimes go even or just outright win a lot of laning phases. Obviously, you can still have a hard time into your Renekton's, into your Jaxes. Both these champions can nullify her, but like, if you play around them, then sometimes you can like find these angles where you can like either outscale, or you can you can just play around your team a bit more. So they are kind of unplayable. They aren't like super aggressively unplayable to the point where like it's Olaf into Argot, for example, which is very Olaf favored. So yeah, Camille, very strong at the moment, really high skill ceiling. If you want to sink a lot of time into a champion, then Camille tends to be pretty solid as like an option in that space. Heimerdinger, still a solid A tier pick. Probably sits towards the low end of the A tier as he's pretty unpopular, but there's definitely value to a champion like Heimerdinger. His pushing capability, his damage output, there's just a lot of potential on this pick, but once again, pretty niche. You're not going to see any Heimerdingers really. It would be rare to see one Heimerdinger a season. Like, that's just how like niche this pick is at the moment. Cho'Gath, Ornn, Poppy, and Alawi wrap up my A tier. So in Cho'Gath's case, there are some different build variations. Obviously, we've got like the Heartsteals, the Warmogs, the Sunfires, the Trinity Forces even. I know Kerboss is really promoting that as like a variation. I keep like promoting him. Obviously, he tends to be a pretty big innovator of like build variations, especially as someone I follow at the moment. But yeah, Cho'Gath, definitely potential there. Obviously he's been buffed pretty aggressively as a stat stick option in his current state, and there can be situations where he can just outright win laning phases against champions which just don't have the tools to really approach his kit. Obviously, his W can be really powerful in a lot of situations as well. And, like, there are some hybrid AP variations and just some outright AP variations, which I've seen some people opt into. But if you just want something standard, then, yeah, the tank build, the Heartsteel, into, like, primarily just tank items, alongside, like, an Emax with Grasp can be really powerful. And you can still go Q with Comet Max, and that can also work quite nicely. I know there's some, like, Halo Blades as well. But anyway, I digress. Grasp for Emax, Arcane Comet for Q Max. There are different builds there, but just go tank if you want like mostly just consistency. In Ornn's case, I think he's one of the best bread and butter tank champions in the game. He does a lot of damage. He has great supportive capabilities. The item upgrades can be really powerful and allow him to have pretty aggressive scaling. He has good isolated 1v1 potential in a lot of situations, especially if you're ahead of the curve. This champion can actually be quite hard to really fight against. If you fall behind, then yeah, you can sit back, you can utilize your CC. You won't obviously be as durable, but there's still a lot of power to this pick, and I really do think he's a high A tier pick at the moment. Kind of just let down by his outright carry capability. It's just not really there compared to some of the other S tier options. Poppy and Alawi. Poppy is great into dash champions and like matchups where she can really utilize her W and her E quite potently. Her Q, great harass tool combined with her passive, actually equates to a lot of damage early on to the game. She doesn't scale quite as aggressively as some of the other tank options, but into matchups like the Ornn, she can be really powerful. That W can really shut him down and like deny him from being able to utilize his CC. So her scaling can kind of be attributed to just how much value her W does have. In Alawi's case, she's one of the closest to being moved up to the A tier. She's been in a pretty good spot for a while now. I know there's some of Voltaic Cyclosword builds which can definitely function if you're looking for something a bit more aggressive, but you can just go like the standard tank slash AD bruiser variations and find decent success. This pick's in a good spot. Obviously there tends to be some matchups which she's pretty non-favored into, and if you ban them out or you tend to like utilize her as a counter pick, then she can definitely jump up the tier list to the S tier. Malphite is actually going to move up to the A tier as well. So Malphite got buffed this patch. Pretty nice. Was a passive buff, which actually does help him a bit more than like just a generic health buff, as it is on a different regen timer to his base health. Like if you can get your passive up, you gain more armor out of that, which can be really strong in like matchups where he is already pretty powerful in. That does help his W max build as well, but being the W max with grasp, and you're playing more around your ability to just fist fight with the enemy laner. Obviously, if you're not really comfortable with that, then Q max with Arcane Comet can still be a solid fallback pattern, and still, I mean, receives help with this buff. So yeah, Malphite, solid A tier pick. Champion dropping down though is going to be Nasus. So Nasus got nerfed this patch. The E no longer scales as well. It hurts his ability to lane into certain matchups. It obviously pushes him back towards just primarily playing Fleet or Grasp, and just for Q-Max variant, you're not really going to play E-Max Nasus anymore. Like, it's kind of just gone. Yeah, they really help that ability. So, yeah, Nasus, play Q-Max, play Grasp or Fleet. You should find a lot of success still. He's just not quite S tier. He tends to be a bit more situation now. That is kind of the TLDR. Shen is my pick to watch this patch. Well, I mean, he was my pick to watch last patch going into this patch, but he's still the pick to watch. I think this champion is in a very good spot now. If you're not comfortable with your individualistic carry capability, and you know someone else on your team can carry you, whether that's a duo or an ADC, play Shen. Shen can be really valuable in those situations, and he can really nullify kill threats across the map, which can be really valuable in a lot of situations. So pretty good pick. Tends to be a bit more counter pick reliant the higher up you go in ranks, but lower ranks you can oftentimes win lane in a lot of situations with this champion just because of his raw damage capability. And obviously they buffed up his passive shielding, which gives him some more upfront survivability and HP. I guess I'll just describe it as that. So yeah, Shen, solid S tier pick. Bit more situational than some of the other champions here, but really good in those situations where you can rely on a different carry. Zac kind of faded out of the top lane at the moment. He's still a very good pick though. His survivability in a lot of laning phases combined with his builds and his mid-game damage, all very powerful. He doesn't scale as aggressively as some of the other options here, but he definitely has a bit more carry capability than something like an Ornn. Like Zac does output arguably a bit more damage, but Ornn obviously does have the additional CC combos, which I mean Zac does as well, like the E, the Q, the R, all forms of CC. So yeah, both these champions I'd say are pretty akin to each other. Zac just has arguably a bit more mid-game agency, but doesn't really scale as aggressively. still a good champion though. Yorick, one of the best S tier picks at the moment. Like, I think Yorick is really slept on as a champion. His ability to just stat check most picks in the game, almost every single top laner, he can just outright stat check if he is even or ahead of the curve. Even behind in situations like this, champion can be really hard for some champions to ever really match. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of potential there. So Yorick, don't sleep on him. He tends to be pretty aggressively low elo skewed though. He can function in the jungle as well. That is another capability of this pick, but I mean, obviously you're just primarily going to play him in the top lane. Ban Aurelia if you're not comfortable with that matchup, but oftentimes you'll just have bad Aurelia players and like below Emerald, arguably, like once you get to Diamond, you probably should just ban that matchup if you are blinding Yorick. I wouldn't really recommend blinding Yorick though. Yeah, he tends to be a bit more counter pick reliant, but Yorick, great S tier pick. The other champions here, we have Tahm Kench. This is still the Heartsteel, Riftmaker, Rocket Belt, Rabadon variation. It's still really good. It's still what I'd recommend playing him as. Obviously, I've been going on about this for like what feels like the entire split at this point, even before this split, I think. Yeah, it's been really good for a while. It's definitely something which can function really well on him, especially in mid and low elo. It's probably free LP. He might also be like Yorick tiers of like strong. Like both these picks could arguably be moved up to the S tier, but yeah. Tahm Kench, that build variation, really strong at the moment. Volibear tends to be a bit more volatile. I actually have him on the lower end of the S tier in his current state. This is like the Roa Flicker Blades variant, which is reliant on like Jack of Trades for like a bit more damage amp there. The build's still really strong though, and can definitely be really impressive for a lot of champions to lane against, so it is very deserving of an S tier spot. And then the 4 champions I have left. So Argot is primarily my main. I mean, I play Argot and Ornn as like my 2 main champions. I think Argot's in a great spot now. Obviously, towards the beginning of his split, he was really struggling to the large amounts of range which was being played. Now that that's kind of faded out, we're getting a lot more melee champions being played just across the board. Argot really benefits from that. The core build looks to just be Cleaver, Steric, and then you can go Stridebreaker into situations where like you're playing against a decent amount of range. You can go at like first slot, second slot, third slot, fourth slot. There tends to be like loads of situations where you can go it. In fact, I almost default on it in most games as like a fourth slot item, as it tends to just be pretty generically good at this point. So yeah, build, I'd recommend going like Cleaver, Steric, Overlord's Bloodmail, Stridebreaker as like a 4 item core. Last Thought tends to be pretty flexible. Warmogs, Deadmans, Kanek Rook, and there are options there for you. But yeah, I got very good S tier pick. Definitely one of the champions I really recommend climbing with out of low elo at the moment, especially on the last patch of the split. And then 3 more champions here. We have Mordekaiser, which is still a great low elo pick. They try to like really adjust him out of being like a really low elo, mid elo dominant champion, but they never really quite got there. He's still really powerful in those areas. Non-QS ultimate obviously did kind of help him in high elo, where people were more consistently opting into that item, but it wasn't anywhere near of an aggressive swing as a lot of people thought it would be. And yeah, this pick's still great in mid and low elo as like an AP option. It's probably the best AP option there. Yeah, your build's going to be like your Ryla, your Liandry's, your Riftmaker, and then you can go into like tank variations or just AP variations, which can also work to a degree of success. And then the last 2 picks here, we have Set and we have Garen. Obviously, we all know how strong Garen is at this point. He is like dominant in the mid lane, dominant in the top lane, dominant across most ranks as well, which is crazy to think about. I'm surprised he didn't get enough going into 40.18, but I guess the idea was he's not going to really see that much play at Worlds, although I think he might see some, especially if like Nasus still sees some play, but I don't know if Nasus will see play. But yeah, Garen in a really good spot at the moment. Can definitely fall weak into certain matchups where he could either be like bullied out of lane a bit. His laning phase tends to be his weaker area, especially if he's not able to get the ball rolling, whether that's getting like your Zerkas early, your Stridebreaker early, your level 9 spike, you're not able to run Ignite in certain matchups, stuff like that. But in mid low elo, you shouldn't really run into these level of problems. Ignite is what I'd recommend as default. Stridebreaker, Zerkas, Phantom Dancer, and then like IE 3rd item, and you should just run lobbies. This pick's at a great spot at the moment. Yeah, very deserving of a S tier pick. And then Set has been good for a while. He's obviously very generic, and he can really struggle into like kiting matchups where he is not able to ever really get in stride breaker range. But you're never really going to be abused that hard up until like Diamond Master Plus. So set can still operate really powerfully in mid and low MMRs. Obviously the build tends to be the stride breaker, hole breaker, Steric, 3-item core. And you can be a bit more flexible later on, whether you opt into things like Overlord. I mean, you tend to opt into Overlord's Blood Mail. That tends to be default as like a 4th item. But then last slot can be like Dead Bads, can be Sky, can be Cleaver, stuff like that could all work quite nicely on set. And yeah, he's a really solid S tier pick at the moment. Honestly, all the S tier champions are pretty locked in their current spots, especially with like buffs and nerfs. The two which I'd say are probably the weakest are Zac and Volibear, but they tend to be a bit more niche or a bit more volatile. The other 7 picks here, yeah, all really good in their current states, great for mid and low MMRs. I'd really recommend playing them if you're looking to like gain some LP before the end of the split. And then yeah, look forward to 14.19. We got a huge amount of item changes, some mini reworks to Tristana and Cassandre, and should be good. But yeah, these are the picks I'd recommend. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.